My aim is to discuss what it means to cross faith boundaries in the UK today, and as a way into that, I'm going to discuss two books I read that talk about the experiences and the work of theologically conservative Christian and Muslim groups. Just before I do that, three kind of opening observations. One is that for many people in the UK today, faith is kind of irrelevant and they don't really understand it. So when I tell people that I'm a vicar and I work in interfaith, some people kind of dive straight in there with really helpful questions. Other people kind of look at me blankly and think they have no clue what that means, which is fine. It makes for an interesting conversation. For other people, faith is kind of the background noise. I was very interested to read a study, for example, about madrasa attendance patterns, kind of which madrasa parents pick for their children in Cardiff. And it seemed it was as much to do with their route to work and from work as it was to do with the theology of the madrasa, which I thought was fascinating. Talk about that later if you want. And then for other people, faith is central to personal and corporate identity. Maybe that's particularly those people who've made this kind of crossing of a boundary to enter either, that might be within their own faith or from one faith to another. So the first book is this one, The Making of a Salafi Muslim Woman. Annabel Ainge did a PhD ethnographic fieldwork working with a particular couple of groups of conservative Salafi women in, I think it was Birmingham and London. And this is some of the things that she found. One was that all of her participants were religious in some sense, but they were confused by the ambiguity of the faith that they grew up in, be that some of them Christianity, some of them Islam, and then they all experienced some kind of spiritual awakening, generally one in which their peers were quite important in. These people then all navigated what she calls the Islam market and settled on Salafism. And one of the interesting things that she found was that these people were quite naive about all the differences and nuances within Islam and didn't necessarily have that much knowledge about the different groups that were there. But what they did all say was that Salafism gave them peace and tranquility as it's in quotes, true and correct form of Islam. And then two things kind of happened. Either people became more and more and more committed, or they sort of drifted away. For those who were more and more committed, one of the things they found was it was quite difficult to form community. As they joined this particular group, some of their old friendships died off, but it wasn't always easy to form new ones. Generally speaking, as they started engaging with Salafist teachings, they encountered significant tension with their parents, whether their parents were Muslim or Christian or of no faith. They were mainly quite young, and for them university was quite a dangerous place, whether that was because they had to meet with other Muslims, whether it was because they had to go to mixed gender classes, or whether it was because they had to take an interest-bearing loan out in order to complete their studies. And they found it quite difficult to work out what career to take, again, partly because in most office environments it's quite difficult to say as a woman, I don't want to be near men. So primary school teaching became quite a good option. One of the bits I found most fascinating, I'm not going to read it out now, was the matchmaking process and the very detailed questionnaires these women prepared to be given to prospective partners, and they had to fill them all out, explaining their theological qualifications and suitability to be a husband. Happily, my wife didn't do that to me. They all became very socially isolated, which was interesting, because their old relationships were not necessarily replaced by new ones. And part of the problem is this next thing of a potentially judgmental peer group, because you've got a very clear standard that you can hold everybody else against. And if someone is visibly failing to meet up to that standard, then it's very easy to be judgmental about them, to exclude them. Probably partly because of this questionnaire process, but partly maybe just difficulty in finding somebody who is as conservative religiously as you. They struggled to find husbands, and those who did manage to find husbands then struggled to raise their family, because their children may not want to conform to the strict interpretation of Islam that their parents have. lots of social attitudes are against this form of Islam, and various aspects of government policy, and I'm sure you can work out what they are, make it particularly difficult. So the conclusions, finally then, is that many people are attracted and are joining and are finding inner peace from the rational and deliberative process of Salafism. And again, what was quite interesting to me was to discover that there's a significant movement from Christianity into this form of Islam, particularly amongst people of Afro-Caribbean heritage. And Annabel Ian suggests that she thinks two possible things could happen with this group. Either they're going to withdraw more and more from wider society and kind of exist in a very isolated social bubble, or they will develop the capacity to become more flexible and engage with wider society. And I guess only time will tell which one of those happens, or maybe both, but in different ways. So that's a very quick dive through that book. And on to the next one. This one is about a very conservative Christian group by a lady called Anna Stroman, and her title is Aliens and Strangers, which picks up a verse in the New Testament that talks about Christians as aliens and strangers in the world. Aliens as in people who have no home, rather than as in little green men. Interestingly, I wasn't at all surprised to find when she's talking about conservative evangelical Christianity, she begins by talking about sex. Because it's a key area of debate within conservative Christianity. And the debate about sexuality in that world is a proxy debate about the authority of the Bible. So a conservative evangelical Christian understanding of debate is it's not really about the presenting issue, it's about your attitude towards the biblical text and whether you prioritise that or culture and that kind of thing. And we can debate whether that's an accurate way of approaching it or not, but that's the way in which this issue is approached from that perspective. Another particular area of struggle for this group is their conviction that they need to speak of Jesus in every context, and then their perceived and actual experience of opposition to doing that, particularly in a work context. So there is this very strong desire to tell people about Jesus, but is this a socially acceptable thing to do in work or not? And then you get narratives of experiences of persecution and so forth. There was a lot of discussion about the need to listen to the Bible, and how do you actually do that? What does it actually mean to study the Bible together in groups? How do we actually understand and interpret it for today? And then related to that, a big struggle to have a coherent faith. Particularly kind of the interplay between what people thought God was telling them to do and the kind of mess of day-to-day experience. Strachan then goes on to talk about whether Christian faith is a crutch, and this is an accusation often used to attack Christianity. It's kind of, well, it's only for the poor and the weak who need a crutch to keep them going. Interestingly, someone within this study group said, yeah, it is a crutch, and that shows I'm mature. I've grown up, I realise I can't do things by myself. I'm supported, and I found the right support, and I've become the person I've been made to be. But within that, there was also a definite distrust of emotionality and expressing and experiencing emotion. So one of Strachan's criticisms is that the group, or people within this group, never really got to the deep issues at the heart of their problems, because they weren't able to express their emotions properly. She did say that evangelical Christian faith provides an overarching order for these people as they attend their church, but at the same time they have to wrestle with what she calls internal and external fragmentation, or to put it slightly differently, with the mess of urban modernity, of self-sufficient individualism, and the precariousness of individual practices. So you've got basically these the tension between their aspirations, and kind of a very literalist take on the Bible, and then the reality of daily life in 21st century London, and how those two things do or don't work together. Some common themes in both these groups. One is around a tight in-group. One is around suspicion of outsiders, and then a narrative that may develop on that around persecution. One is around social isolation and ostracism, and that again feeding into a narrative of persecution. But then, interestingly, the desire to get people to join is actually often quite successful. So on the one hand, it's kind of, well, it's very isolating and we feel very persecuted and it's very difficult, but on the other hand, actually, other people think, well, I want to join you anyway. So that leaves me, well, with 3 questions that we can come back to. When and where is encouraging boundary crossing either within faiths or across faiths acceptable? How do we respond to differences in belief, again, either within or across faiths? And how do we develop a secure identity rooted in our own beliefs? Thank you. That's great. Thank you.